For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm continuing on one of my importance of different sectors and different areas of society series. I'm talking about the game industry and board games and card games today. And this is something that comes up on page quite a lot, and I thought it would be fun to talk about. And also something I don't really talk about very much on any of my social media is I am also a game designer, so there's that. So if you were around for the episode on the arts, that was one hell of an episode. It was long. I don't know that this one will be as long, but it might be, so strap on in. So, where to begin? I guess I'm going to keep this pretty similar to last time in terms of let's talk about which games I'm going to be referring to. So there's Blackjack, and this is probably the one that comes up on page the most. There's Poker, which does come up on page at least once. Imperial Affairs is a rare game, but it does actually come up in Miss Nakagami. We'll talk about that in more detail later. One Up, One Down is a drinking game that makes an appearance a few times. And then there's Beasts and Blood, which makes an appearance in Shadow on the Snow. And a lot of these games, like Blackjack and Poker and drinking games, are often tied in our world to gambling. And gambling is a bit of a touchy subject in that land because while in many lands it's not illegal, it is very heavily stigmatized, and gambling with money actually is illegal in Hukai. You can't do that. Like, you can do the friendly wagers and, you lose this game, you buy me another drink. That's pretty common to do. Monetary gambling is completely illegal, and there's probably an underground den somewhere where it happens, but you don't want to be there. Yeah, perhaps in a surprise to no one at this point if you've hung around the podcast for a while, almost the polar opposite of that. It's not hard to find places to gamble with money, and quite a lot of money. It's kind of everywhere. It is, to an extent, encouraged. There are casinos all over the capital of Liera, and even the nobility of Liera do engage with this, and the whole thing's just kind of disgusting, as it is in our world. So, yay. But that is, the encouragement and widespread nature of it, that in Liera is very unique to Liera. And gambling does have a very strong association with mercenaries. A lot of those sorts of places are tied to mercenary activities or fronts to mercenary activities, or that sort of thing. So this is another reason why people, particularly in Hukai, have outlawed it, is because they don't want mercenaries anywhere near them for a lot of reasons at this point. A lot of it does tie into the downfall and some of the things that happened shortly after the downfall. But that said, Hukai, there are quite a lot of mercenaries here at Hukai, so I don't know that it entirely worked the way they wanted it to. Keeping on the sort of thread to Imperial times and the Imperial culture, games were a big thing in Imperial culture, and it was something that was done in sort of governmental spaces, almost a CPD. In the sense that people would play lots of big strategy games and things like that to keep them sharp, keep them thinking in new ways, encourage creative thinking, and people did this as citizens as well. There were game houses and things like that. I'll talk more about that later on. And it was also a thing amongst, the poorer classes and the slaves as well, that they would make little games and little versions of things. It was a really big part of imperial culture. And in the contemporary space, pretty much all of those still exist in their various forms. So there's a form of blackjack really for kind of every nation, and it is different, and a lot of that ties back to imperial times, and just no one's really compromised on that, because why wouldn't everybody have their own version? That's cool. And games nowadays are often a bit more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but they have more, they have better craftsmanship behind them. And a lot of games now don't, the more modern games that are being created now, don't rely on just cards, and they're not just drinking games or just dice. They often combine a lot of different things, and a board, and masks, and all sorts. They can be really quite complicated. Strategy games are very popular. It's a really big industry. It's a huge industry. It's one of the biggest employers across the continent, really. It is. It's massive, between board games, card games, drinking games. Drinking games, not so much, but board games, card games, dice games. I mean, some brewing chains do get involved in drinking games and do, make, some legitimate things out of that, and it's a big deal. And there's a big overlap with the publishing industry in literature as well, because a lot of these things are written about in books, if it's contemporary setting, or whether people write in alternate worlds in that world, and then they still bring things like blackjack or imperial affairs or drinking games or whatever. So you might get limited edition, say, Hanafuda cards that are themed to a particular book or a particular series or characters. That is a big thing that people do. And the game industry is kind of artist central. It's where a lot of artists get work, is, designing cards and illustrating cards, making fancy dice, making masks, or different things like that. Because cards aren't necessarily as simple as, here's just a standard pack of cards. Most nations have their own versions of these, and in Hukai there are actually there's a modern and an imperial deck of cards, and they're not the same thing. An imperial deck of cards only has 40 cards in it. The modern deck is bigger. The suits, I believe, are the same. I'm not entirely sure on that, but the imperial set has 4 suits, and that's Camellia, Feather, Droplet, and Shuriken. And in Malassau, this is different. It's the suits are different in just about every nation. The number of cards in a deck isn't necessarily the same. So Malassau card decks are bigger because they have cards associated with the royals or sometimes revolutionaries. They have much more of that, which Hukai just doesn't have. And while a lot of games are very casual, drinking games or people playing blackjack among friends, there's a lot of casual play of card games and board games and things like that. There is also competitive, leagues and tournaments around these things sometimes. I mean, Beasts and Blood is as good an example of any of a game that can get very competitive, and any strategy game really has this. It has a competitive scene, and it can be quite lucrative, and that can be a little thorny in Hukai, because where's the line between that and gambling? Gambling can be directly involved in that if people want to place a bet on who's going to win. So the Hukis are sometimes a bit funny about it, and they don't really like the competitive gaming scene that much. They're okay with it sort of casual competitive where there's no monetary reward, but as soon as you bring the money into it, it gets a little thorny. But the place where this is the biggest deal is in Malassau. So let's talk about a few of these games. Let's start with Blackjack, seeing as that's the one that comes up the most. Now, in our world, there are a few different games and versions of Blackjack that, correspond to, do you get to 21, or do you beat the dealer, or is it this, or is it that? And that is the same there. In our world, they call these slightly different things, so there's Blackjack, and there's Pontoon, and there's another version, but they don't have, distinctly different names like that. It's just, Hugh Key's Blackjack, or Malassau Blackjack, or Soleil's Blackjack, or so on. So, generally speaking, and this does come up on page in Black Executioner, slight differences in the rule, like are we trying to get to 21, or are we beating the dealer? Does the 5-card trick work? And for those that don't know the 5-card trick, that's just if you have 5 cards, then if you have 5 cards that equal 21, you sort of automatically win. Or at least that's the version of Blackjack I know. Might be different for you. Or how aces work is another one, because aces, in that world and in the version of Blackjack I know, default to being either 1 or 11, and you can choose, and that choice can change at any time, but that's not always necessarily true. And you get into differences when you bring in things like picture cards as well, because in places like Malassau, a picture card, say King card, is worth 10, but in Hukai that card just doesn't exist if you're talking about Hukey's Blackjack. So it's quite a different game. I'm not aware that there are competitive leagues around Blackjack. It's often just a casual game played in bars. There's a thing in casinos as well. In Liera, basically, Liera really is the only place that has proper full-on casinos. Other nations will have, casual gambling in bars, or maybe a corner that is a gambling space, but a full-on casino is not something you'll see outside of Liera. Poker is another game that is pretty common, but has a lot of different variants. So, like with us, we have variants where you hold your cards, or variants where they're on the table, and this is the same there as well. There are different versions of this. Yukai... there's a bit of a mixed bag around this in Hukai, because it's a bit of a north-south divide. If you're in the north of Hukai, generally speaking, you'll be holding your cards. If you're in the south, chances are you're not. And if you're in Malassau, the cards will be on the table. If you're in Liera, the cards will be on the table as well. Yeah, this is something that varies, and I have cards by nation as a little note on here, and that is true here as well. I did touch on this earlier. Having different card packs by nation, different decks. And that does impact the game quite a lot if you're talking about the Royal Flush, for example. That exists in Malassau. It doesn't in Hukai. So be aware of what rules you're getting into. Because, especially if there's gambling involved, you can get fucked over by just fewer hands in some places, or in a lot of places, just having ace high or whatever, that's not considered a hand, that's just junk. Imperial Affairs is an interesting game. This is actually played in Mr. Nakagami between Haru and one of the antagonists. Haru is challenged to a game of Imperial Affairs with some quite high stakes behind it in context, but I can't really get into that because that is huge spoiler territory. And Imperial Affairs is an interesting game because it changes drastically depending on the number of players in it. You can play with just 2, which is the version that is in Mr. Nakagami. You get the Rising Sun and the Emperor as the 2 roles. But you can play with up to 12 people if I remember correctly. It's either 11 or 12. And each player has a role. So there are lots of different roles. There's the emperor, there's the flautist, there's the hunter, there's the captain, there's the housewife, there's the child, and the child is notoriously ridiculously funny to play as. There's the spy, like, it goes on, there are a lot. And each role has a specific ability. So the emperor can draw an extra card every so often, but once you get above 5 players, there's a secondary secret ability that you can also use, and one of the child's abilities is being able to swap all the hands of everybody. That's like completely at random. It's a very funny card. And the origin of this game is very murky. Because it's not like blackjack or poker that have just like existed forever. Imperial Affairs is a much more recent game, but no one's exactly sure when it's from. And there are rumours that some of the original portraits on cards, not all of them have them, but some original cards did have portraits of these different characters on them, and some people claim that they look like people who did exist back in Imperial era, but then not necessarily that clearly styled, so it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string. Like, yeah, that looks like someone who could have existed, but like they don't look particularly distinct. Or, oh, but they have a scar on their face. Like, oh yeah, a lot of people do. So it's not entirely clear, and some of the abilities, and particularly the secondary abilities and how they interact with each other, seem to mirror some rumoured events in the Downfall and the lead up to the Downfall, which is a little strange. There is a rumour around this game that originally this came from different groups of separatists in the partition, that it was actually the game of the Huqi separatists. And it didn't originate as a game, it originated as a strategy plan. They had identified key people and were trying to predict their actions in different scenarios using packs of cards, is the rumour. Because another thing with Imperial Affairs is that you can have multiple packs of cards in it. And the whole idea of the game is that you try and collect different suits of cards, or it can get a bit more complicated with more people involved, and there are certain roles that aren't supposed to come in until you hit 5 players or until you hit 7 players, but some people take that rule with a pinch of salt. And that people theorise about that quite a lot. That can't necessarily be confirmed as a theory that that's what happened, but nobody's willing to rule it out either. The only definite thing that's known is that it is at least Huqi's in origin, because it is designed around Imperial Huqi's cards. And other types of cards existed at the time and were in use at the time. So it is either Huqi's imperial origin or Huqi's separatist origin, or someone being very clever about disguising what they're doing. But no one's really willing to rule out any of those. One Up, One Down is a drinking game that's very common, and I wanted to bring this up because it comes up quite a few times on page. And this is one of those games that has a direct tie to the White Star Brewing Alliance. The White Star Alliance of Brewing is known for very strong alcohol. So this is a game that uses 3 people. You have 2 participants and a host, and the host has 2 coins. And the participants each pick a sigil on a coin, so effectively heads and tails, and the host then flips the coins in a particular sequence, and like this can vary, so it can be flip one coin, flip the other coin, then flip them both together, or flip them together, then flip. It doesn't matter, but it's some combination of those three, roughly evenly. And depending on which way up the coins land, that determines who drinks and who doesn't. And basically it's just a last man standing, whoever passes out drunk first is the loser. So it's maybe not surprising that this comes directly from a brewing company, and yes, it is, like, low-key just a marketing ploy. Regardless, this is a popular game that is played a lot, and it comes up in two notable matches on page, and they're actually both in Mr. Nekagami. It will also come up in As Seen on Stage almost invariably, and Isamu has a fun little trick that he's taught both I and Haru about how to flip a coin and make it land the way you want. Isamu uses this power without any hesitation. Isamu can also do a very similar thing with a dice, and dice are used in variants of one up, one down as well. There are quite a few variants of the game that can range from being fairly harmless, very similar game, to being not quite so harmless, or just very silly. There is some very silly drinking games as well. And going back to these notable matches, one of the most notable is I and Coney. And this is very shortly after Coney gets the job being I's assistant. And I, Haru, and Coney decide to get a drink together to break the ice. Get to know each other a bit. And then one of them suggests that they play this game. And Haru decides that he's going to be the host. And yeah, I already knows that this isn't going to end well for him. Haru is having way too much fun with this. Haru decides to be particularly mean by playing this with whiskey as well. Usually this is a game played with soju, and you just, like, take a shot, which is probably not a very pleasant experience, I'll say. I haven't actually had soju myself, but with whiskey, oh boy, that's rough. So I notoriously has fuck all alcohol tolerance. This man drinks bitter and he drinks it in half pints. And he drinks it in half pints for a reason. Coney, meanwhile, I'm not convinced he can get drunk. There's a scene in Penstemon where he drinks, is it 13 shots? In very quick succession, in like 30-odd degree heat, and he's like slightly tipsy when he gets home. Yeah. This doesn't end very well for I. I'm pretty sure I is just immobile the next day, because he ends up drinking? Something like 10 shots of whiskey or something. He is not okay. But I is a happy drunk at least, so there's that. And it's fun for everybody involved, because Haru is the one hosting. And it does work. I mean, it's very clear at a point that Haru is rigging the coin flips, and Coney, as anxious and terrified as he is all the time, it does get a smile and a giggle out of him, because it is just very funny, because drunk I decides that a good thing to do is to challenge Haru, who's very clearly rigging what's going on. And it doesn't end well, that. And it kind of looks like I'm confidently wrong, and Haru's loving every minute of it. It's one of those things that just makes me smile. A very different take on it is also present in Mr. Nakagami with Haru and Hanzo, though, and this is played with soju this time, and I's hosting instead. And the difference here is that Haru has a pretty decent alcohol tolerance. He can drink 2 or 3 glasses of red wine without that much of an issue. And Hanzo, I mean, he's notorious by that point in his life for being a bit hardcore with the booze. He's a whiskey drinker and he's not afraid to drink more than he should. So I has the job here of making sure that Haru wins the game, but Hanzo has a beady eye. If it's too obvious that I is rigging what's going on, Hanzo will know about it. And dealing with an unconscious Haru and Hanzo, who I does not trust at all, is just not a situation he wants to be in. Especially because he knows then that Hanzo will challenge him, and there's no chance that goes well for him. And that's a very interesting exchange, and does lead to another exchange later that I cannot talk about because spoilers, but that one's very fun as well. So last but not least, let's talk about Beasts and Blood. Now, Beasts and Blood is a very complicated game. There are a lot of different bits going on. There are cards, there are tokens, there are strategies, there are different animals. Like, there is a lot going on. There are a lot of mechanics. And it originates from Malassau myth. There's a lot of mythological influence in there with the different animals of myth, and different animals that are told of in myth, and the sort of roles and attributes and sigils and everything that they have. A lot of it has a deep basis in that, both the old versions of myths and the new versions, and crossing over and all of that. And playing it in Malassau is quite a unique experience compared to just playing it anywhere else, because you can get copies of it and versions of it anywhere. But the Malassans take this game very seriously. This really is their pride and joy as a nation, and it's one thing that just about everyone can agree on with that. Malassau have game houses. They have specific buildings set up to play these games in, and this is partly because of the competitive gaming scene, but they do have these for just sort of casual play as well. It is massive in Malassau, and they have entire rooms and all sorts set up for Beasts and Blood. And Beasts and Blood it's a single player game. It's a strategy game, and it's you and effectively versus the host. I hesitate to say Game Master because it makes you think Dungeons and Dragons, but like that's not what it is. Like, there are different maps that the Game Master will sort of choose at somewhat random for you to use, and you do have to beat the Game Master in single combat with different, beasts and things. That is a thing, but it's not like an RPG or anything like that. It is a strategy game. And in Malassau, in Malassau game houses, it's a very serious deal. They'll have, all the lighting set up just so and everything. And one of the things you can do, one of the ways that the game works in terms of who wins in the different combat matches, is that there's a scale. And like the old legal scales where it's 2 plates, and the plates have to be a particular way so that the player wins. There has to be a set number of weights on the other side of the scale. And in Malassau game houses, there are a few different sort of items you can pick up to help you get to this point. So you can get a free sacrifice card you can use, there's a lot you can do, but one of the items is, and a lot of casual players don't include this, because, you'll understand why in a minute. What you can do to substitute one of the weights on the scale, and the weights are calibrated for this reason, is you can pull a tooth out. to use as a weight. That is perfectly legal within the game's rules, and the weights are calibrated so that the average weight of a tooth is the same as the weight. And I do have a character who has done this. I won't say who, but it is a thing that has happened canonically to one of my characters. This game comes up in Shadow on the Snow because I and Shinichi get to playing it during sort of downtime just to keep themselves busy as much as anything and just think about something else. And at one point, neither of them could sleep. They just sort of end up sitting outside for a minute. And I was like, I know we don't have our maps or tokens or anything handy, but we could just play it anyway. And she's like, exactly how do you intend on doing that? And I was like, close your eyes and just, I can do it to you through just audio, trust me, I can do this. And it's quite a cute moment because they're both stressed before that. That's why they can't sleep. And, they're just playing this game and, they get competitive with each other about it. And it's like, oh, no, I won that one. I won that combat, I did. And it gets them smiling and laughing a little bit. And that's one of those moments in Shadow on the Snow I really like and I think is really important to include in a military thriller in particular, I think. Another thing I wanted to mention with Beast and Blood is that if you play it in the sort of proper Malassau Gamehouse way, a lot of the cards end up getting permanently marked with things or ruined in some way. So this is another huge deal for artists, is there are a lot of artists who just work on cards for this game all the time because so many of them get ruined in gameplay. So notable practitioners within the game industry, Isamu is a big one. He hosts a lot of drinking games, be it working in a bar, that's one of the things he does and loves doing, is hosting games of one up, one down, or poker, or blackjack, or really anything else. Proper board games, not so much. Daneth is a big fan of Malassau game houses, perhaps unsurprisingly, being as Malassau as he is. He likes to go there quite a lot and play different games. He does also play things like blackjack and poker just casually with his friends. That's something he does, honestly, quite a lot of. He's not a drinking game guy, though, he might play with Hanzo every now and then, but otherwise he's not really interested. He's a beer man. He doesn't want to drink spirits. He doesn't like them that much, I don't think. I think that's about all I have for this episode. If you enjoy this series, the best way of knowing when the next episode is coming really is to subscribe. There's no two ways about it. There's no schedule for this podcast. I don't know when the next one's coming, so there's that. The other way you can find out about this in advance is on Instagram. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. It is the home of the podcast. You get advance notice of what the episode for the week is, and soundbite teaser reels and more as and when I experiment with it. That's Instagram, Jade_Black21. If you like all this world building and all that sort of stuff and all the art that if you like world building and art and all of that side of things, hit me up on Pinterest. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. And if you like hearing about my writing and want to see semi-live updates on writing and how stuff like this comes up on page and snippets of that, hit me up on Twitter. I'm JadeBlack21 on there. And last but certainly not least, if you are a publisher on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. I'm jade42black@gmail.com if you want to email me. There is a list of things I want to know in the description. Please include that in your initial contact so I don't have to give automatic no's. If and when I get inundated, it's no good for anybody. A couple of things to note. If you are indie and self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from. Other things to note, no age category restrictions, no genre restrictions, it doesn't have to be new release, it doesn't have to be out yet either, and it doesn't have to be a novel. Novellas are welcome, poetry is welcome, overview of a trilogy, whatever you want to do, bring it in, let's see what we can work out. And until next time, friends, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, it helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me, copyright JBlack 2024.